subscribe!
Once upon a time, there was a wise man from the fighting game, brought his wisdom of negative edging to the wasteland of Zenless Zone Zero, turning Zenless Zone Zero community into a civilization single-handedly. And today, I am here to take this civilization of Zenless Zone Zero to the Mars, cause I am coming from the harder game than EO. You see, averagely a fighting game would only have about 100 to 150 APMs, which is action per minute, how many buttons you can press in 1 minute. An average professional StarCraft athlete could perform about 250 to 350 APM, and the game that I'm coming from is averagely about 500 APMs. It's the game that only true gamer could harness. The Love Live High School Festivals. It is so OG that it's out of service, and I moved to this more casual version of Love Live, which still need 200 APMs, and that still makes me better than EO. Anyway, all the jokes and meme aside, I think EO has already served his sentence of being bombarded by the memes from the community, probably more than he deserved it, but nonetheless, I think nobody could stand the levels of ego that he was flexing. The god descended from the fighting game to enlighten the Neanderthal of Zenless Zone Zero.
Wuthering Waves community, the Neo Genshin community, does not have a me.
I do think that his channel is kind of a banger if you want to learn some really cool technique from him. So let's just stop it right there and move on to talks about Yanagi. So there's a lot of YouTube videos out there saying that Yanagi is the hardest character in Zenless Zone Zero. Sitting on the high horse, chant about, you need a lot of skill to play Yanagi right and how intricate her kits and combos are. While technically they are not wrong, but Yanagi actually has two sides. The hard Yanagi! You need to get every combos right, every kits right to utilize her into the fullest potential, and probably has the highest skill ceiling than all the characters in Zenless Zone Zero. And the other side is, she is also as forgiving as Mommy. If I were to be completely honest, if you mash the button with Yanagi, you could probably utilize 70% of her power. When you compare Yanagi to other characters like Alanjo, Soldier 11, and Su Yuan, she's actually a very forgiving character to play. Like for Soldier 11, if you don't press the button at the right paces, you're gonna lose all your damage. And as for Alanjo, if you miss your last hit for whatever reason, whether it's dodging or getting interrupted by the enemy, you would lose half of her damage in this combo. And as for Zhu Yuan, if you didn't time her out and her skill right, when enemy is stunned, you would lose majority of her damage, which is very unforgiving. So if we are looking at this perspective, she is actually one of the easiest characters to play, maybe second to Jane though. And even if we compare to other support like Sokaku, Nicole, if you don't play them right, you're gonna lose a lot of buff, making these characters simply useless if you don't utilize them right. But Yanagi doesn't have any of these problems at all. You could just get away with whole skill then spam attacks. So yeah, Yanagi is not only just strong, but also very forgiving, even if you mess up, which is very mobile phone friendly. That's a weird way to say that you're not a skill-oriented player. So I'm like, why complicate your life when you can just play it in the easier way? And I'm about to share it. But even if you're like the most skillful player, I think these tips would also give you a good time on autopiloting when you're dealing with the daily grind or the weekly grind. So let's go over with the basics. I think at this point everybody knows that Yanagi has two stances. One of them gives you more invincibility and the other one gives you more AoE with less protection. And it doesn't really matter which stances you're on, because both of them give roughly the same amounts of damage and normally build up. And you could also swap to the other stances with just simply tapping the skill without wasting any energy. So we're gonna start from basic 1, 2, 3 into 4, 5 and press swap, then into 3, 4, 5, swap, 3, 4, 5. And actually you can kind of spam it until the last animation like this. Like in this yellow stance, just be aware of animation that she launching herself up to the air. And the other animation in the other stance is the one that is slicing enemy with a really big AoE with this really cool move. Then just tap the skill button after those animation, and it's gonna be so much easier than trying to pace it. And again, the basic 1-2 is actually really fast, like this one. Like, it took less than a second to get into 3-4-5. So there's almost no punishment, even if you mess up and use basic 1-2. So all you need to do is really just to spam the basics and pay attention to the last animation, then swap it. You don't necessarily have to pace it unless you want to do like no dodge or parry challenge, which is totally unnecessary in general. It looks really cool, but it's not gonna give you significant amounts of DPS increase. And it's gonna become part of your muscle memories over time. I mean, like every characters is the hardest characters in the first few days when you just got them. So yeah, that's tip number 1. You could spam the normal attacks and swap the stance when you see the animation. And tips number 2, use the whole skill as your panics button, because it's not only would just change your stance, but also give Yanagi buff on disorder damage on Yanagi's Polarized Disorder and disorder damage from any other teammate. It would give you invulnerability and also teleport yourself right onto the enemy. And as long as your buff is on, you're not gonna be able to hit basic 1-2, which hit like a wet noodles. It's gonna take you right into 3-4-5, and that would even give you more leeway with spamming the basic attacks. That's why she's so forgiving to play. And this Yanagi's buff would lead us to the tip number 3, and that is instead of parrying, is default yourself into dodge, counter, and parry, because this is so much more easier than just parrying. And it's not only just give you extensive amount of invincibility, like from dodge to counter attacks to parry, which is really long. This sequence in itself also deal the same amounts of damage and anomaly build up as much as the last basic attacks of Yanagi. So this move in itself is basically equivalent to the last basic attacks of Yanagi, which is huge. But keep in mind that if you perform this move without the Yanagi's buff, it's gonna take you right back into the basic 1-2 when you press the basic attacks. It's not gonna change into 3-4-5. And yeah, that's really it with how you cheese with Yanagi. And of course, there are lots more nuance to that, especially if you're trying to parry it. And I think lots of that could only get good from just playing it in the endless tower over and over. The more you play her, the more you're gonna get better. Which there's a lots of videos out there already discuss about it, so I don't need to invent the wheel again. As the bonus clip of today is explaining the disorder mechanics of Yanagi, and of course it's the advanced one. And the first basic thing that I think some players out there already know this, but the way that Polarized Disorder works is based on the anomaly that is previously applied. So if I have my level 10 Korean without any gear, building up the anomaly and have Yanagi to use Polarized Disorder on top of that, it would only get 9,800 damage as compared to Soldier 11 in standard build. I got 30,000. And if I build the Electro Anomaly with Yanagi on top of that and Polarized Disorder on it, I would get 120,000 damage, as you can see from comparison. And if you're using Bernice, which is anomaly characters, Jando, Piper, Grace, any anomaly oriented unit, you would get high Polarized Disorder damage. So how are we going to apply these mechanics? One is simply to just use another anomaly characters, which is what we are already doing. But if you're playing in the Mono Electrics comp, the strongest team would be Chinyi and Rina team. So the problem with Mono Electrics Yanagi team is that the anomaly stat on the Chinyi Rina is not high, but it is inevitable that I'm gonna build the anomaly on the enemy with them. And if I use Polarized Disorder on top of that, I'm gonna get 80,000 damage. So it would make more sense if I use the ultimate on top of that to override the anomaly that Chinyi and Rina builds up. And as you can see, if I use Polarized Disorder on top of that, I would get 420,000. And the other thing that people might wonder is that how much exactly does Yanagi buff the disorder? So we trigger a disorder without Yanagi's buff as a control, which is 90,000. And we keep doing the test with the buff throughout the process. And we got about 16% damage increase from overall damage. And this part is quite important. We buff it at the last moment. We don't buff it all the way. We only buff when we are about to trigger the disorder. And we got exactly the same amounts of number. So I makes another test with Yanagi triggering the disorder directly, and I got almost exactly the same amounts of number. And the last test is kind of hard to do, but we're gonna trigger with Yanagi again, but with the delayed hit, which is we wait until the burn almost ran out and then hit it with Yanagi's skill. And we got slightly even more damage. I think it has to do with the way they multiply the damage, but regardless, the differences is totally negligible. So the conclusion is actually pretty simple, which is you don't need to worry about pre-buffing Yanagi before you trigger the disorder. But I was only doing the test with fire and normally only. And if you watch my other disorder related videos, you would know that the fire wouldn't lose any damage even if you trigger it at the last second. But I've never included the test in the videos, so I think this is a pretty good chance to show it. And the other two elements, physical and ice, even though I didn't test these elements with Yanagi yet, but it would probably lose about 2 to 5% damage on the last second you procs it, which is totally negligible. But if we are talking about triggering disorder on electrics or ether, it does matter. You don't need to stress over it because you don't actually lose that much. Or maybe it is, depends on your goal. Here's the number. You lose 0% before 1.5 second, you lose 7% before 4 second and 14, and you lose 14% damage after 4 second until the last second. And it's impossible for me to test the ether because ether in itself is very inconsistent, but based on the tests that I've done on ether, the way it lost its damage is probably the same with electrics, but we don't really have any anomaly ether unit yet, so there's no point of talking about it, to be honest. And yeah, that's about it, and never ever question the integrity of my guide and the information I given in the videos, cause I'm the best player in the galaxy coming from the hardest game in the universe. Anyway, I'm just messing around. Feel free to leave your opinions whether you agree or disagree, or if you have any question. And don't forget to like and sub. See you guys.